Welcome to Bible Study for Progressives, a show where moderates, liberals, and leftists of all faiths and ideologies come together to discuss scripture, spirituality, and politics. On today's show, we're going to be talking about the sex scandal in the Catholic Church and the reforms that are needed to address that. I have with me today Professor Joseph Dowd, Attorney Una Lee Yost, the author of Mind, Media, and Madness, Alt Facts, Fake News, Russian Hacking, and What's Next, Lisa Snow, and my father, the Reverend Carl Procida. My name is Rich Procida, and I write about scripture, spirituality, politics, and the supernatural at modernlectionaries.blogspot.com. Let's begin. The Catholic sex abuse scandal requires major reform by Rich Procida. The days of an all-male celibate priesthood are over. Not only is the writing on the wall, it's painted in big red letters. 50 years after the sexual revolution and in the midst of a new awareness of sexual abuse called the Me Too movement, the exclusion of women from the priesthood and the focus on chastity are relics of an age long past. Sexual purity may have served a purpose when the male leader of the household held the power of life and death over the women, children, and slaves beneath him. In a world where widespread slavery included sexual slavery, refusing to have intercourse with the designated male was an act of resistance and liberation. Today, the freedom to choose one's lover and the terms of that relationship, whether gay, straight, bi, or transgender, etc., is becoming more and more a fundamental right. A 2nd century Christian text tells us the story of Thecla, a chaste woman who is said to have preached alongside Paul. One day, they came upon a man who desired her and offered Paul money for her. When Paul denied knowing her, the man attempted to rape her. She fought him off and injured him, so he brought her before the governor on charges of assaulting a nobleman. The governor sentenced her to be mauled by wild animals. But when they threw her to the lions, a lioness turned and fought off the male lions. In the context of antiquity, the focus on chastity may have served a purpose. Today, sexual purity may actually reinforce male domination. At a minimum, personal piety diverts us from our true calling to do good works. Abstinence does little to make the world a better place. It's unrealistic to expect human beings to be sexually wholly impure. Sexual purity doesn't even make sense, and it isn't even desirable. Sex cannot be described as a pure, loving act where we float above the bed in spiritual ecstasy while rose petals rain down from above. Human sexuality is more rough and tumble than that. The church has lost all credibility in this area, and it never really offered a healthy, well-rounded approach to human sexuality anyway. It should get out of people's bedrooms and refocus on the common good. Pursuing moral purity, self-flagellation, and the other types of penitence many Catholics are calling for in response to the scandal are ways of doing nothing. Calling for bishops to resign in Mass regardless of their individual culpability is a way for the church and churchgoers to avoid changing themselves. The changes that are required will be both structural and theological. The focus on purity has always been a luxury of rich churches and those comfortable with the status quo. Churches in poorer regions of the world have, like Jesus, tended to focus on economic and social justice issues. Pope Francis has already moved in this direction, but he needs to do more. He needs to de-emphasize the Church's teaching on sexuality and prioritize justice advocacy instead. Allowing women to become priests, removing the requirement of celibacy, and pruning the Church's outdated teaching on sexuality will not by themselves solve the problem of predator priests. There is a question about whether the requirement of celibacy attracts persons who are uncomfortable with their sexualities. Many institutions, from schools and police departments to corporations and the media, all have to enact policies and procedures to deal with the misuse of authority and other unlawful conduct. There are many people who, when given the opportunity, will abuse their power. The Church has, over the last few decades, taken actions and enacted procedures to identify and respond appropriately to these situations now and in the future. The underlying problem is the culture of male rule. Sexual abuse is at the heart of patriarchy. Male domination has always engendered sexual exploitation. Patriarchy, and thereby sexual domination, is embedded in the foundation of our culture from ancient times to the present. The ancient focus on chastity, the sexual revolution, and the Me Too movement were all ways to resist oppression. Today, we are becoming aware of how male domination has led to systems of sexual subordination and the inability of our institutions to cope with the shameful truth of sexual abuse. It's not just the Church. Hollywood moguls, universities, and other institutions have seen scandals. It's often the victims of abuse who feel ashamed, and people who come into contact with that abuse can also feel shame. This shame is what leads to silence. Shame is a feature of sexual abuse. It operates to shield the perpetrator from prosecution, especially when victims think they won't be believed or that the system will be turned against them. Shame may also be a part of the reason some survivors become abusers. Abuse can be confusing, and people have conflicted feelings about the abuse and the abuser. The cycle of abuse ultimately perpetuates the domination system that supports the current social order and the privileges of being white, male, wealthy, or powerful. The solution to the Catholic Church's continued crisis is to move away from a celibate, all-male priesthood, personal salvation, moral purity, and orthodoxy, and focus instead on doing social justice work. This will include not only charity work, but also justice advocacy and spiritual activism. Congregations should advocate on behalf of the poor, marginalized, and oppressed. Churchgoers should attend marches and demonstrations together, write letters to and lobby lawmakers, attend public meetings and educate the public about issues of social justice and public welfare. This will restore the Church to its original mission, to bring God's salvation to the ends of the earth. Now let's turn to our discussion. So, should or will the Church get rid of an all-male priesthood?
Well, I guess I would think there's just my opinion, but it's not really based on scripture or anything like that. But I think that priests as being counselors to people, by not having a family, by not having relationships like that, just opinion. I think it's hard for them to maybe counsel and relate to people in a way that's effective without having had some of those very basic experiences. I'm, of course, found with somebody on Facebook who is a priest, and he was talking about this. It was a private group because he said he's still forming his opinions. But somebody had pointed out that argument about celibacy and stuff, and he pointed out, people abuse kids, in all walks of life, and he pointed out the church has taken action to try to identify potential perpetrators to keep them out. His comment was that he felt, though, that the culture still did not promote healthy emotional health. The focus was still on scripture and not providing priests an opportunity to develop emotionally, to maybe handle everything that was going on, number one. I think that, and he mentioned that they're working towards that. I think he was speaking out about that a little bit more. He also mentioned something that was interesting, and that was that having people come into the priesthood or the seminary later in life would be a huge benefit to change that culture a little bit, to add different perspectives and different life experiences. So there's that way of doing it. He wasn't advocating for not having celibacy, but perhaps encouraging people to enter the priesthood later so that they could bring those experiences with them.
One of the things is that the original celibacy requirement began, I think, in about the 11th or 12th century. And it was so that that the property would not be inherited by the wife. The church wanted that property. So that was the original meaning. Before that, priests had wives, they even had concubines or other lovers, and they were quite open about it. But that was the original meaning. And then one of the things about coming in older is that this tendency towards pedophilia sort of rears its head in early adulthood. It might be like somebody's 18, they might not be aware of it yet. They've just come out of childhood, right? So it's very hard to distinguish, between being attracted to children when you are a child, right? But around early 20s, boom, it pops up, and these people may already be in seminary. And then I just question what would attract a person to a celibate lifestyle. The idea of sacrificing to God doesn't make any sense to me, unless a person might be uncomfortable. There might be a group of people who are attracted to that because they're uncomfortable with their sexualities.
That could be, particularly at such a young age.
Yeah. And then, so coming older in life might be part of another solution. Did you have any opinions, Joe?
Yeah. As for your question, whether there will be ever women priests in the Catholic Church, my suspicion is yes. Eventually, cultural shifts will bring that about. Now, as you know, I currently I was raised Catholic. I currently attend an Episcopal church, and as an Episcopalian, I'm definitely in favor of opening the priesthood up to women, as the Episcopal Church already has. Now, as for the connection between that and the sexual abuse of children in the Catholic Church, I think we need to be careful here and be very data driven, because it's really easy for people, including me, to come up with all sorts of theories about why this is a problem for celibate priests. I mean, it seems obvious to me, right? Like if you have young men with no sexual experience entering a celibate priesthood, that might cause, I'm not a psychologist, but it might lead to all sorts of neuroses and whatnot that could contribute to something like this. But again, I think we need to be careful and data-driven, because, for example, I haven't looked at the statistics about whether the sexual abuse of children is actually more prevalent among Catholic clergy than among other clergy, and I'd like to see those numbers, because Protestant clergy aren't celibate. The The priests of the Eastern Orthodox Church are not celibate. The bishops are expected not to marry once they've become bishops. But so yeah, it would be interesting to look at those numbers, and I want to see those numbers. And I even remember hearing or reading in several places. Again, this is not, don't quote me on this. But I remember reading in a few places that actually, statistically, it seems the majority of people who sexually abuse children are not what psychologists would categorize as pedophiles. That is, their primary sexual orientation is not toward kids. I have no idea whether that's true. That's just something I've read in a couple of places. But that would be a really important piece of the puzzle, however exactly it fits in. And I do really agree, Rich, with what you said about a kind of an overly romantic view of sex being a problem. And I think that's really a problem in the Catholic Church right now, speaking as someone who grew up in the Catholic Church. I mean, people will often stereotype religious folks as being sex negative, as being, sex is dirty. And some of the early church fathers who influenced Catholic theology did seem to hold that view. But if you read, say, during his papacy, John Paul II wrote a book titled, or I don't know if this was while he was Pope or before, but anyway, he wrote a book titled Theology of the Body. And it presented it was a very beautiful, really, a romantic view of sex, right? His whole argument about why sex should be, first within marriage and only between a man and woman, and it should be always open to procreation, no condoms or anything. It was all based on this idea that in sex, each partner is kind of giving themselves completely to the other. And so there has to be a complete, meeting of hearts as well as bodies in the act. It's a very beautiful picture. Of course, it has nothing to do with the Catholic Church's traditional reasons for limiting sex to marriage. But my point is, I think a lot of people just have it wrong about modern religious conservatives and sex. I think that religious conservatives are all, sex is nasty and dirty. No, the problem actually is the opposite. The problem is they have this overly kind of pretty romantic view of sex. And I think, as you say, that is a real problem sometimes.
Yeah. There's no BDSM in that vision right there.
No.
Well, I think that I read somewhere that in the report in Pittsburgh or Pennsylvania, they said that it was at 8% of the priests, and that normally it's 3%. I guess they may have been talking about just misconduct of employees, and that may have been just part of that report and what they found out. The larger problem is, why couldn't the church deal with it appropriately? And go ahead.
That was going to be my point, as far as there was the issue of the abuse, which is one thing, but the really terrific thing added on top of that was really the reaction of the higher people in the church who were concealing it and hiding it and allowing it to continue, which kind of goes to an intellectual maturity when it comes to the subject matter and how it should be handled, right? I think.
Right.
And because there is the problem, there'll probably always be the problem if there's people involved.
Right.
But again,
one thing I was going to say is that even in the Protestant church, I think they say it's equal numbers, but I think it's still male rule. And it's part of the theory, at least, is that male rule, male domination sort of leads to this system of sexual exploitation in the church. And I talked a little bit about shame, and it's not just the church, it's the university. Here's these people are walking past, seeing this guy, Jerry Sandusky, for example, abusing children. The head coach has heard about it, but nobody can deal with it. I think we sometimes look and we have to put things in perspective. I mean, there's this, I read in the news, the director of the I think it was the Center for Disease Control or something like that, or the ex-director got arrested for grabbing somebody's behind, right? So that's one form of sexual abuse. Then we go all the way through criminal activity, and to look at violence and abuse, we have to also put into perspective the United States giving bombs to Saudi Arabia to bomb buses full of school children. So we have a whole continuum here, and I think sometimes we get so emotional and have difficulty dealing with sexual abuse because of the shame and because it's sex, and somehow we have this history of demonizing sort of sexual behavior, making it look evil rather than having a healthy view of it. And then also that idea of shame that I think people may have witnessed Jerry Sandusky doing it, but couldn't bring themselves to do anything about it. And we want to say, oh, they're criminals, or they were just neglecting their responsibility. But I think there's a larger psychological thing that's going on where it's difficult to deal with this issue in institutions. I mean, it's shaming. You don't want to talk about it. You don't talk about sex.
Well, and I think it just comes to power and authority, and a tendency to defer to those in power and authority and not usurp it. We see it politically now as Congress has capitulated. And then there's also, though, the opposite, where you have like FLDS, where the church sanctions almost the sexual abuse of children. And there may be people in that situation within that sect where people want to speak out against it, but the people in power have set the rules up to where it's acceptable within that community. So it's so many variations.
Yeah, I think that's not untrue about the country. I mean, the sexual harassment laws really came into effect in the 60s. I mean, before that, there were no sexual harassment laws. There wasn't even a concept. I just heard Ruth Bader Ginsburg say that they didn't even have a concept. They didn't think it was actually even happening, but it was happening. I wrote a book on pornography, and the laws on child sexual abuse were only developed in Japan in 2000. You know, that before that they didn't really recognize it. So and then the Me Too movement with all this abuse coming out, it's sort of like a growing awareness of things that the culture wasn't aware of before, even though it's always been happening.
Yeah, I think some of like the Me Too and the growing awareness as you're talking about, I think that has a lot to do with, because again, I came in, graduated, I was in male industries and stuff like that, so we can go through stories. But the thing is there were so few women in power or in an ability to influence. So even though those laws came into effect, there's kind of like paper tigers to some extent, every once in a while to get enforced, right? I think the significance of Me Too happening and some of the civil rights when it comes to racial relations is happening is because now there's been generations of people who've grown up with the expectations that these things won't happen to them. So when it does, it's a big deal. And the workplaces are much more diverse. So there's more women in powers of management, in corporate structures. It's not just one, it's kind of filtered throughout. Still not equal, but a lot more. So when somebody speaks up, there's still more voices within the organization who can go, oh yeah, this isn't going to keep going. This is going to stop, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's why the rise of Me Too is happening now. Finally, it seems like, and it's kind of like enough is enough instead of Me Too,
Right. And that might be part of the problem with an all-male priesthood. And basically this is a patriarchal institution who is held on to patriarchy and is not letting patriarchy go. And that's all that an all-male priesthood is. And then if we can compare it to, say, the way minorities, blacks particularly, are treated by our justice system. I mean, we hear they get beat up by police when they go into and they get convicted of crimes. They spend more time in jail for the same crime. We don't realize what white privilege is. I mean, I'll give you an example. As a teenager, I got arrested for something serious, right? But part of the reason I think I was able to get off of it, besides being smart and taking the right steps after that, was that I was white. You put a black kid in that same situation and they're going to throw the book at him. And I've been in hearings, in courtrooms and Social Security hearings, and I realized that there's sort of this subconscious, unaware sort of something about the color of that skin makes people have a reaction in some ways that they're not credible or they're the stereotype. So and then we got the story of Thecla, in which the judge decides, well, she was assaulted, I'm going to throw her to the lions, right? So that's sort of, if you have a system in which men dominate, and then somehow, and the treatment of rich people being better, that somehow there's a sympathy that's developed, or an understanding, or some sort of connection between, say, the judge and the defendant that isn't there when you have a black person there. And even if it's a black judge, sometimes the institution is already set against that person. Do you have anything to say, Dan?
Well, I think that dealing with, first of all, I think that every man should be able to find, with some good luck and with the grace of God, a mate for himself that would last his whole life. There's something wonderful about a family that is in harmony with one another. And there's a lot of difficulties now to get that in a family because both parents are working, and the kids are left with others here and there, So I think that the institution of marriage is a wonderful institution, and everything should be done in order to strengthen it and support it, because one of the issues in human life is loneliness. And if there are a lot of women out there who can't find a mate, and because we have so many guys out there who are just out there for sexual satisfaction and not for anything else, and they want to avoid any kind of financial problems if they ever get married. I think that our laws now have a fairly just separation clause. You have to, so the woman, if she made so much money, and the man who made so much money, it has to be shared. If the house has to be sold, it has to be sold, so each could get their share part. If she raised children, then there's the issue of raising children. What's more healthy than a healthy father and a healthy mother, mentally and physically? It's great to have a family around you, and to participate with other family members. So the Catholic Church wants to definitely support marriage. There's no doubt about that, And I think the whole society is built on the fact that we have to keep jobs going for everybody as best we can, so that families can have extra money to enjoy their life here in this in the United States or wherever they are, So and then it's the thing that in the scriptures and in Jesus's point of view, he puts everything underneath the commandment that if you have faith in me, then everybody else has to realize that your allegiance to your Christian faith is above every other relationship in life.
So one of the main point I think of that I made in the article was that this celibacy, abstinence, sexual purity, none of this is really necessary nor important, nor does it make the world a better place. It doesn't really do anything. It's almost like a self-infatuation with one's own perfection. So it's not necessary. And then the second point is that the church should allow ordained women because they should do what's right. And we've lived in a patriarchy, and we're still in a patriarchy, but at this point, there's been a women's equality movement. So this is not really acceptable. It's not acceptable to have an all-male leadership. It just simply is not acceptable. Go ahead, Una. I'm glad you have some. Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, you
Oh,
go
I
ahead
was just
first.
going to say real quickly, you say it's not necessary. I think one of the things to point out is there's two things. Is it necessary? Yes or no? The answer is no. Is it harmful? Yes or no? And even for putting the priest thing aside, the message that it sends, I think could be argued that it is harmful as far as also perpetuating the idea of this patriarchy that you're referring to.
Right.
That's it.
And also that a lot of people talk about the shame that they have grown up and built up around sexuality. So this is all sort of a part of that.
She's ready.
Oh, okay. So you asked me before whether I thought that priests should continue to be required to be celibate, and I've given thought about it. And then, in my view, I don't think that Scripture mandates it. It's not required, and it's more of a man-made law, something that was added and causes a burden on people. And I think that God created marriage as a gift for people, and He created male and female as sexual beings. I mean, we're more than sexual beings, of course, but
Right.
That's how He created us. And most people probably have a desire to get married. And it doesn't mean that everyone has to. There are people who have the gift of singleness, and that's great too. But I think that should be voluntary, something that the individual offers up to God. And I think marriage, in my view, can be a beautiful example pointing towards Jesus as the head of the church and the church his bride. Another thing I want to mention is that I do agree that churches do need to work on patriarchy, and in particular with respect to women in leadership, that women who are gifted in the areas of teaching or preaching, that they should be able to live into their calling. On the other hand, for me personally, and I know there are differing views on this, I don't think that necessarily means that one needs to completely do away with standards of sexual purity. And I guess in my mind, I think it's not as much of an either or rather than an and. As far as my own understanding of Scripture, like I think about, for example, James 1:27, where it says, and maybe you guys could share what your thoughts are on this, but like James 1:27, where he talks about how religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So I think where I'm at, I'm kind of on a journey, but I think where I'm at right now is more in terms of my own understanding of the Bible, I'm more morally conservative and socially liberal. But when I say morally conservative, it's more with respect to standards for myself, not necessarily standards for others. I guess I would say I'm more liberal towards others and what they feel called in their relationship with God. Yeah.
Very good. So, Joseph, I know I caught you in the middle there.
Yeah. Well, I just a few points that I thought of while you were speaking. One thing is, okay, so you brought up both the issue of women priests and the issue of married priests. And I think it's important to understand a distinction that's drawn in Catholic thought between doctrine and discipline. So doctrines are these teachings, these official teachings of the church that, at least in theory, I mean, historically this is a bit dubious, but at least in theory, all of these doctrines are supposed to have developed out of, evolved out of teachings handed down by the apostles of Jesus. Okay, now, so those form the official teaching of the church. Then there are various disciplines that the church can impose on its followers that aren't necessarily mandated by doctrine. And the Catholic hierarchy is aware of this. So, I mean, even the most conservative Catholic theologian will tell you that the thing about priests not marrying is not a doctrine. It's a discipline that was imposed for various reasons a few hundred years after the beginning of Christianity. So whereas I think many Catholic theologians would view the male-only priesthood as being a matter of doctrine. Now, whether they should view it that way is another question. But I think it's important to note that there is a much bigger obstacle to women priests currently in the Catholic Church than there is to married priests. I think I'm pretty sure we will have married priests in the Catholic Church. I mean, we already do because, okay, this is going to get really complicated, but there are different rites within the Catholic Church. RITE, right. The most widespread is the Latin rite. It's called Latin because it was originally only said in Latin. But then you also have these various Eastern churches, basically Eastern Orthodox churches who either never split away from Rome or who later rejoined Rome. And they don't have this discipline of celibacy. So I think that changing the ban on married priests is, for better or worse, a lot easier than changing the ban on women priests. Another thing I'd say is, I think we need to think about what role a celibate priesthood was playing for the people who entered into it. Again, I'm not a psychologist, but I can think of all sorts of reasons why certain people might be attracted to a celibate priesthood. Say people who are asexual, or people who are gay, but don't feel comfortable, being open about it, or people who just, to use the current slang, have really bad game, right? The thing is, I think we're moving toward. I think the Catholic Church is going to move toward more openness about sexuality and about a married priesthood. And I think that's good. I wholly support that. But I do think we have to think about, what role was this celibate priesthood playing for certain individuals? And what are we going to do for those individuals? I mean, I definitely think that helping women and racial minorities and LGBT folks and other people who have historically been oppressed is a more morally weighty goal than helping some young men who can't get laid or whatever, or maybe some there are asexuals, people who just don't have a desire for sex. But I think we do need to think about just the psychological well-being of everyone involved, and what we are going to do for the people who, for whatever reason, felt drawn toward a celibate priesthood.
Una, your quote. You read that passage again that you had?
James 1:27, it says, "Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world."
So I look at that, and I usually look at all these scriptures this way, is that the caring for the widows and the ways of the world are the ways of domination, the domination system. So it wouldn't be, but our friend Bert says, well, there are still purity codes. There are purity codes against, for example, eating bugs in this country, whereas in other countries, it's okay to eat insects, but to us, that's yucky, So we do have some purity codes. But that's just how I tend to interpret those types of things. Not so much that, even though, and I look at the purity things, I tend to think of, well, Jesus was talking about the Pharisees and their codes and the law and how we need to sort of break away from that in order to do justice and to actually follow what Scripture is, rather than it not being about our personal salvation or our personal morality, which is obviously not orthodox. I'm not really that orthodox, but more about
I want to say this, that
social
I think
justice.
that in this verse and in other verses about purity, it's I think the church from the very beginning, and the Jews also, frowned very strongly against fornication and so forth. So I think that term, divorcing yourself from the impurity of the world, definitely had to do with any kind of sexual promiscuity.
This has been Bible Study for Progressives. Tell your friends about us and share us on social media. Follow us, subscribe to our podcast, and like us on Facebook. You can also find this show and more at my blog, modernlectionaries.blogspot.com. My name is Rich Procida. Thank you for listening.